All right, welcome everyone to a new episode of the Neuroflex podcast. I am your host, Toby Passman. If you guys have ever heard of audio-visual entrainment, this is a really cool technology that helps to entrain the electrical rhythms of your brain through the use of pulses coming in through headphones, along with flickering lights where you're watching through an eye set. This helps entrain the brain, also boosts blood flow, and increases oxygenation to the brain. So that's one of the tools that we offer here at Neuroflex. If you guys are interested and in the Miami Fort Lauderdale area, go over to neuroflex.com. Check us out. You can also shoot me an email, toby@neuroflex.com. On today's show, we have two very special guests. The first is Ross Spears, who is a doctoral candidate pursuing a degree in counselor education and supervision at the University of Texas at San Antonio. He served in several departmental leadership capacities, including past president and vice president of UTSA's Neurofeedback Society. For his dissertation, Ross plans to explore what experts regard as essential learning competencies for counseling students completing either neurofeedback training or related coursework. His research interests include cultural humility, counselor education teaching strategies, and integrating neurofeedback with counseling. In addition, Ross continues to assist with several graduate-level counseling courses while providing counseling and neurofeedback services to the San Antonio community. He is supervised by the current president of ISNR, Dr. Mark Jones. And now our second guest today, we have Whitney Rich. And Whitney is a doctoral student studying counselor education and supervision at the University of Texas at San Antonio. And she's a previous graduate assistant for UTSA's Introduction to Neurofeedback course and a current member of UTSA's Neurofeedback Society. Her research interests include mindfulness-based relaxation techniques, group counseling, multicultural counseling competencies, and utilizing neurofeedback with counseling. She is particularly interested in helping to make counseling more accessible to traditionally non-help seeking populations. So Ross and Whitney, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. So I guess I'd like to hear from each of you guys, like what initially drew you guys into the mental health kind of space, and also kind of tell me a little about each of your guys's kind of introduction to neurofeedback and how you got started with it.
Yeah, so I guess I can go first. So I think growing up, I was told by certain individuals that, I think for a lot of counselors that we're good listeners. And so although I was receiving that affirmation growing up, I really didn't pursue the counseling track until undergrad. And I took a lot of career assessments, and that was the one reoccurring profession. So I just decided to stick with it. So here I am today. And then when it comes to neurofeedback, when I was applying to master's and doctoral courses, the counseling profession really places emphasis on different therapeutic modalities, including empirical techniques as well as others. And so I really like the neurofeedback aspect because it also lets clients know that their brain is contributing to some of their behaviors or symptoms. And so we can take responsibility off of the client or blame or the stigma associated with these diagnoses and really promote the best wellness and promote a more healthy identity for these clients. So that's how I got into neurofeedback and counseling. What about you, Whitney?
I got into clinical mental health initially. So I am a non-traditionally aged student. And so I came from a liberal arts background. And so I went back into social sciences because it felt like clinical mental health offered a way for people to really change in a very positive and empowering way. And it offered hope in a way that I was very positive. And then pursuing research felt like the next step for me because it seemed like the wellspring that makes sense that was feeding that counseling uh, source. And then neurofeedback came from just what it is, that adjunct therapy for people who have exhausted, like people in those spaces of trauma, and they're like, I've tried everything. And so it was just that modality you could pair with counseling. You're like, this is, one more tool. And so that was how I initially, and Dr. Jones is based in UTSA, and it was an incredible resource in our program. So that was how I initially came into neurofeedback.
Okay. And in terms of like what you guys have seen kind of working with neurofeedback with these populations, I'd love to just hear some of the experiences and, in terms of dealing with trauma. I know that was kind of the focus of your guys' ISNR presentation and, in terms of like with first responders. I'd just love to hear kind of some of the experiences and just how, in your guys' view, neurofeedback can be, a really powerful tool in terms of combating that trauma. So maybe we could reverse the order this time. I'd love to hear from you first, Whitney.
Um, well, our uh, center, I got lost in your question slightly.
Yeah, I can repeat it. Yeah,
Please.
I was basically just asking in terms of like your experience actually like working with neurofeedback, kind of some of the results that you guys have seen, and particularly the, working with the population of like, first responders and treating trauma, and just how you guys see neurofeedback sort of being a powerful tool in dealing with some of those issues.
Okay. So my experience with neurofeedback clinically has been within the Soraya Center, like UTSA's lab. And so we specifically screen there for PTSD and anxiety. And it has been positive. We see clients who report um, like reduced symptoms and feeling calmer, feeling more in tune with their bodies, um, heightened heightened awareness. Um, in terms of law enforcement, we haven't run specific clinical studies uh, research wise.
Got it.
More, we're doing field work.
Awesome. Okay. And how about you, Ross?
Sure. Yeah. So with law enforcement, that's the next step. So we did that conceptual piece of putting why neurofeedback may be a beneficial resource for these individuals. But within the UTSA's neurofeedback lab, as well as in private practice, I think the most beneficial thing for these clients that come in with PTSD or anxiety or depression, I think Whitney said it, hit the nail on the head, is they've exhausted all their resources. They've tried counseling, they've tried medication. Sometimes their medication is not having the best side effects, and so they're desperate for something different. And I think they see neurofeedback as a beneficial resource because as we work with them, we're also explaining, you know, the process that your brain is undergoing through, creating new neural pathways for a more beneficial um, output, I guess is a good word for it. And I think as we talk them through and we're providing psychoeducation, we're also empowering them to take responsibility in their treatment, compared to, sometimes clients for counseling, they come in and expect the counselor to just hand them the resources and tools. But with neurofeedback, we're also advocating that they take responsibility in their treatment, um, and become a member, a partner in this collaboration where they are learning relaxation skills and learning that they can regulate their own body. So when they're outside of the sessions, they have these skills in their toolbox to really empower themselves.
Right. Definitely taking like an active role in their own recovery. What would you guys say, as far as, I know you guys talked a bit about, how trauma kind of changes the brain during your recent presentation at ISNR, and I'd love to just kind of, hear a little bit of that and share that with the listeners in terms of what you guys have found, and then maybe also how neurofeedback and mindfulness-based techniques can, sort of help correct some of those, dysregulations that might occur with trauma.
Sure. Yeah. So when it comes to brain structure, and I'll be fully transparent, in counseling, we briefly talk on it, and then neurofeedback, we talk on it a little bit. So I may not be the full expert. So if I say something wrong, please correct me. But when it comes to PTSD, we see authors and clinicians such as Vanderkolk saying with PTSD, we see excess of frontal slower wave activity with a combination of um, excessive activity in the right temporal lobe. And so that's really promoting a more fear-driven brain, the more anxious. And I think with PTSD, it also combats, the size of the hippocampus and activity of the hippocampi. And then also with the limbic system, you're in that constant flight or fight mode. You're not able to regulate and process information in a more healthier way. Whitney, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. So, okay. So in terms of, some of those brain changes, so what do you sort of, can you maybe, Ross, if you could touch a little more on like how, or like the significance of those findings? I know you touched a little bit, but like just hearing like the excess of frontal slow wave activity, is that sort of like the brain kind of like holding back, trying to like not engage with the world or with its own memories to kind of protect itself? Same with kind of the hippocampus shrinking. Like what is the significance of those kind of findings, do you think?
Yeah, I think the brain's role in some capacity, and its capacity, is to protect you as the individual. And so it's, when it's processing information, when it's taking in hard, difficult, traumatic experiences, it's going to categorize what may be a good experience and what's going to be an experience to stay away from. And so your brain will start making those structural changes, always being in constant fight or fight mode, always being on edge, being anxious, as a way to protect itself and to protect you. So if you're in reoccurring traumatic situations, we're going to continue seeing, I hate to use the words deficit because it makes sense why your brain's doing what it's doing. But at the same time, we see these biomarkers. And as clinicians, we can help. And I don't know if I'm answering your question, but as clinicians, we can provide that psychoeducation. It's like, this is why your brain is behaving the way it is. It's nothing on you. And take that shame and guilt away and say, these are the steps we can take to start regulating your brain and getting out of the fight or fight mode into a more relaxed state, and then change those neural pathways, and then maybe seeing some more healthier biomarkers as well.
And what we do see with clients, and I'm sure you see this too, is that information, that this is a biological component for them, is empowering, and that it's changeable with clients. That this is partly a function of the way my brain was designed, and partly of what I have experienced, and this combination help to create what I am experiencing, but also that this can partially be remedied, like that this offers hope for people. And so you see that as they're like, this psychoeducation piece is added to a counseling session when you explain, oh, you have excess beta, like this is in the posterior section of your brain. This is possibly a reason that you struggle sleeping at night. Your brain revs up. This is possibly a reason that maybe a drink helps you sleep. This could be a component for why um, could have a tendency towards alcoholism. These things are can be revelatory for people, and make them like that component of the shame, like Ross said, like shame and stigma that sometimes keep onto people. Um, that can just get like unstitched, and instead it can be like, oh, we can down train these aspects of your brain, and then they can just start unpacking and undigging and think, oh, and like I said earlier, these are just like an adjunct option, like a pairing therapy with counseling. And really, all counseling is about hope. Because when people have hope, they they have a way out, and then they strengthen their resilience, and then it just builds level upon level in their scaffolding.
Is it usually, in your guys' experience, has it been a hard sell to people? Because in terms of the specific population that you guys work with, just in terms of, I know some of the things that you guys brought up in the ISNR presentation, just about, it maybe kind of being still very like stigmatized within those communities, and, maybe not something that is talked about just amongst like law enforcement officers. Um, what have you guys found, like in terms of people's attitudes towards neurofeedback in conjunction, some with therapy? And do you guys see any like shifts in terms of, compared to, I don't know, 5-10 years ago? Is it something that's becoming like more normal or accepted to have these kind of conversations about mental health, and how it really is, can be like a really a biological problem that is not necessarily because of, or isn't necessarily, isn't at all because of someone's weakness, or they're not tough enough to fight through something. Like what are common you know uh, conversations that you guys have, I guess, with patients you work with?
I
So, oh,
Oh,
go
go
ahead.
for it, Whitney. You got it.
So I have had a lot of conversations, um, or I've had a number of like conversations, and I don't know about, I can't speak to 10 years ago what the temperature of things are, but the conversation currently seems ripe for help. I would say positive in terms of people looking for um, a way, any kind of way. And some of when we talk about neurofeedback, some of the response has been, "Oh, that's a legit science," and intrigue. And people like to understand things. My experience too is that people are genuinely intrigued by their own body, by their own makeup. And if you're offering an explanation, they want to know more about that, especially if it explains, like, we can live our whole lives and be really mysteries unto ourselves. And so if you're helping, um, and you live inside your own skin, and then suddenly you're 40 and you're thinking, oh, wow, I just understood that one piece. And so when, like, when the conceptual paper talk about the organizational stressors, the um, the work, the day-to-day stresses, the anxiety, the depression, the PTSD, and then like living with the pressures of society, like the microscope that law enforcement is actually under. And then you have, say, mental health workers coming on and saying, actually, when we're on the field, we're just listening. And the response we're getting is, people don't do that. Like, no one's asking, or not, no one's asking, but for the most part, people aren't saying, what's your experience? What's it like for you? Because the work culture is, be quiet, don't tell anybody what you're feeling. And then all that starts swirling up inside, and there isn't um, really a way to talk about it. There's not a conversation around it. And really, you don't like suffering isn't necessary. And I think people are really tired of being confused. They're tired of being in pain. They're tired of suffering. And so when you are untangling some of the biology around it, untangling some of the mystery around it, and saying you don't have to suffer, you don't have to. And then the next step is the people around you don't have to. And the next step is things like the pain doesn't have to keep projecting out. I think people respond naturally to good things, and they instinctively recognize the first step starts with them. That didn't tangent.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, I think when it comes to counseling and neurofeedback, they're both beneficial. So we use, I think it could be flip flopped. We use neurofeedback as a way to also um, ease into more counseling based techniques with populations that may be more reluctant. And it makes sense because, as counselors, we learn that the field and profession is a more westernized profession, and it comes from or developed by white individuals, and understanding the implications of that, and maybe some hesitancy from minority groups seeking out those services. But we also see counseling, did I get that right, as a way to weave into neurofeedback with these populations too. But I think going based off of what Whitney was saying, with these traditionally non-help seeking populations such as law enforcement, their training and their profession really emphasizes mutual trust between members, autonomy, self-regulation, and trust. And if these professionals are saying, I have these symptoms, I may have PTSD, I think I'm struggling with anxiety and depression, that automatically negates what their training had taught them of trusting one another, trust, self-autonomy. So that's why they may be more reluctant to receive those counseling services. So the thought is, by integrating neurofeedback, pulling back the stigma and saying it's not that you can't self-regulate, you're not autonomous, you're not strong. It's that your brain is protecting you because of these situations, and that's okay. Let's use a quote unquote more scientific based therapeutic modality instead, because as counselors we're seeing that there are reluctant to receive these services. So how can we mold and shift our understanding and our ability to work with them professionally to meet them where they're at?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what about, in terms of like, I guess with your guys's understanding of like the current landscape of research, and like what would you guys say in terms of if these sort of therapies and neurofeedback, say in particular, was able to be like integrated into traditionally non-help seeking populations, such as first responders, or police forces, if it was something that instead of like, okay, you have PTSD now, there's a serious problem, we're going to give this treatment. Is it possible that just doing neurofeedback is, say, like, if it, making it to be like more of like a training of like, you're going to do these physical trainings to be a cop, and you're going to also do these, this brain training with neurofeedback. Like, do you guys think that could prevent or cut down on sort of the development of these kind of complex trauma or PTSD cases that can develop with just like kind of undealt with repetitive traumas?
I would say yes. I think it's complicated because you need you need onboarding with these higher up occupational officials, as well as buy-in from the law enforcement officers themselves. But we've also seen neurofeedback as both beneficial for I can't think of the word right now, but post-traumatic experience, but also beneficial in um, pre, I don't know why the word's not coming to me, but using it as a using the neurofeedback as a modality to really offset the likelihood of when these traumatic experiences occur, and when, because they will, how the law enforcement processes through that information and moves forward. Is it going to be are we setting them up for success, or are we not? So I think that neurofeedback can and should be an option for these individuals that do undergo a lot of experiences that the rest of the community and population don't have to typically go through themselves.
I think you would benefit, and this is in research. I think you would benefit in departments. And the problem is, like with most things, it's funding and it's support for it. But you would benefit from resilience training in general and overall. That it's access. It's access and it's prioritizing mental care. And so one of the difficulties is the costliness of neurofeedback. There's just a high cost associated. But yes, and just acknowledging that this is a need. Like if you were like what you just suggested, the 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 idea that this could be implemented as like, oh yes, of course, neurofeedback for your for this health and safety of your body. You would be acknowledging like that presence on a department would be acknowledging that like as a valuable human being, your system is going to sustain trauma because you're going to be shot at, you're going to be nervous, like you're going to ramp all the way up when you walk up to a car. If you're on a tactical team, just those alarms when you get called in are going to blare, and then you don't know. Like you don't know what you're walking into. You could turn off within 15 minutes because the situation is remedied, or you could be in a 3-day standoff. Like that kind of just flood that happens to your system. The sort of on and then all the way off. And the way you have to regulate in your brain. Like the sort of acknowledgement that as a human being, you're going through that. And as a community, we value what you're sacrificing. That acknowledgement from an administration alone would allow you as an individual, I think the self-care, you would give that to yourself because it's tough to keep acknowledging it to yourself. Because the truth is, on a fundamental level, self-care is an assertion of worth. And so when we're the only ones talking, when I talk about non-help seeking population, and especially particularly men, because men tend to isolate and they become alone. And that's a broad statement, like not all men, obviously, but they tend to be alone because they don't have communities. They don't form them, as it's not as socially acceptable for men to be to need friends like this. I man up, this terrible language that surrounds what men supposedly need. And so like if they're struggling, they don't communicate. I think I mentioned at the presentation, but just walking onto a field and then how on a training field, a police training field, and it was the presence of a mental health worker being on that field that made the men start speaking to one another. Even some of them spoke to me, but then they spoke to one another. And one of the men came up to me afterwards and was like, "What's happening to my team?" And it was just mental health being normalized. They could talk about it. They could talk to one another. And so back to the original question, an administration that prioritizes mental health, that put funding into it, yes, prioritize resilience training for individuals. Even just the acknowledgement alone, you are valuable. You would add those valuable pieces into your own life because your community says this is valuable. You would carve out that space for yourself. You would say, you know what? I'm really suffering. I think maybe I need a counselor because your community would value in that way. That's just the way that profession works.
Right, right. And it seems like so much more of an uphill battle on an individual level. If, it's not an accepted thing within the community, then it's like you could still, go out and do neurofeedback, but it's like if it was just accepted on a broader scale of like the organization that someone's a part of, it makes a lot of sense to me that, it would just be, a path of a lot less resistance. Well, I know we've come up kind of onto the end of our time here. But in terms of this, in terms of like where people can find more about your guys' work, alongside, in terms of the problem that was just posited about like neurofeedback, the costliness of neurofeedback and attempting to get it into, more organizations, these non-help seeking populations. Any resources that you guys can provide the listeners, like, that any like companies, organizations that are working to help kind of get neurofeedback to be like more accessible to these populations?
Mhm. That is a great question, Toby. And to be honest, the only really resource I can think of is our our counseling department. So UTSA, from my understanding, is one of the few education-based training centers for neurofeedback, or public institutions. I think there's 2 or 3 others that may be private, but that's a whole nother conversation about the lack of training for neurofeedback and with clinicians. Um, so, Whitney, is anything coming to your mind for resources?
No, if I said something, it would be a half a piece of information, so I don't want to. But I will say that when I was looking into it, it surprised me that there wasn't more involvement. And I reminds me of when I was doing some research and I was getting frustrated, and I just kept reading at the bottom of it. This would be a great area for more research, and I was like, huh.
Another
But
dead end.
this would be a great area for more research. No,
Mhm.
I think it's a need. It speaks to the need that's out there, honestly.
Well, hopefully just getting your guys' message out like at big conferences like ISNR and coming on podcasts and stuff, just like the more people that can hear this, and hopefully the right people end up hearing, the need for it and end up being able to do something. What about just in terms of like, I don't know if you guys, if you guys want to provide any sort of contact info, if people are just interested, like specifically your guys' work, or want to get a hold of you, any way that they can do so?
Sure. Yeah. So anyone is more than welcome to email me. So my email is, I guess I can just say it on here, is
Hmm.
James, so James, dot Spears, Spears, at UTSA.edu. And I think, the whole goal with this conceptual presentation about integrating neurofeedback in law enforcement is really that first stepping stone of, now that we have information that suggests that this is a beneficial outlet and resource for this population, what are our next steps forward, whether that be research, funding, grants, working specifically with law enforcement organizations in their communities. So yeah, I think this is a beneficial start of that research and getting the help that these law enforcement officers deserve.
Great. And how about you, Whitney? If anyone wants to learn more about your research or get in contact with you?
Yeah, mine's Whitney, WHITNEY .rich, RICH, at UTSA.edu.
Perfect. We'll include links to those those emails in the show notes. And yeah, I just want to thank you guys for the work that you're doing. I think it's so important, and I really do hope that going forward, just more and more people take notice of the power of neurofeedback to potentially combat such devastating issues related to trauma and PTSD, and be able to really integrate it at a mass scale. So we'll see what the future brings, but I'm hoping it's going to be positive for the field. So I just want to thank you guys again for coming on the show and just sharing all of your knowledge and expertise.
Well, thank you
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.